The sun hung low over the Montana plains that autumn afternoon in 1887, and Thomas Whitaker guided his horse slowly along the creek bed searching for strays from his small herd, and the golden light painted everything in shades of amber and rust. And he thought about how much the land had changed since he first settled here 20 years ago, and how much he had changed with it. He was 53 now, and his beard had gone mostly gray, and his hands were rougher than they used to be. But his eyes were still sharp, and he noticed things that younger men often missed, and that afternoon he noticed something unusual near the old fence line by the water, and at first he thought it might be a deer resting in the tall grass. But as he drew closer, his heart seized in his chest. It was a young woman lying motionless in the dried stubble, and her dress was torn and stained dark with blood, and her face was pale as chalk, and Thomas dismounted quickly, his knees protesting as they always did these days, and he knelt beside her, half expecting to find her already gone from this world. But her eyes opened, and they were green like spring grass and filled with such fear and pain that it made his chest ache, and she looked up at him, and her lips moved trying to form words, and he leaned closer to hear. "Please," she whispered, and her voice was barely there, "and just make it quick." Thomas felt something crack open inside him, and he sat back on his heels and shook his head slowly, and, "No," he said gently, and, "No, I don't think I will." The woman's eyes widened slightly and confusion flickered across her face, and she had expected something different, and Thomas could see that, and he could see the resignation there too, and the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had stopped hoping. "My name is Thomas Whitaker," he said in the same gentle voice he used with frightened horses, "and you're on my land now, and you're safe here, and I'm going to help you if you'll let me." She stared at him, and a single tear rolled down her dusty cheek. "And I can't pay you," she whispered. "And I don't have anything." Thomas shook his head again. "And I didn't ask you to pay me," he said. "And now let's see about getting you somewhere more comfortable, and then we can worry about the rest." He examined her injuries as best he could without moving her too much, and she had been shot twice, and once in the shoulder and once in the side, and the bleeding had slowed but hadn't stopped entirely, and he knew he needed to get her to the house quickly, and he also knew that moving her might finish what the bullets had started. "I'm going to lift you now," he told her, "and it's going to hurt. And I'm sorry for that." And she nodded, almost imperceptibly. Thomas was not a young man anymore, but he had spent decades working this land, and his strength was the kind that came from years of hard, steady labor. And he lifted her as carefully as he could, and she made a small sound of pain but didn't cry out. And he carried her to his horse and somehow managed to get them both mounted with her cradled against his chest. The ride back to his small ranch house seemed to take forever, and the woman drifted in and out of consciousness. And each time she woke, she seemed surprised to still be alive and surprised to find herself held gently instead of roughly. And Thomas talked to her the whole way and told her about the ranch and about his chickens who had personality enough for creatures 10 times their size, and about the old barn cat who had showed up one winter and never left. His house was small and simple, and inside it was clean in the way of a man who had learned to take care of himself after his wife Margaret had passed 8 years ago. And he laid the woman on his own bed and lit every lamp he had, and began the careful work of tending her wounds. He had some experience with this, and ranch life taught you how to deal with injuries both to animals and people, and he boiled water and found clean cloth and the whiskey he kept for occasions that required it, and he worked slowly and methodically, and all the while he talked to her in that same gentle voice. "You're doing fine," he said as he cleaned the wound in her shoulder, "and you're stronger than you think, and we're going to get through this together." She watched him with those green eyes, and sometime during that long night as he stitched and bandaged and tried to make her comfortable, she finally spoke more than a few words. "My name is Sarah," she said, and her voice was stronger now, "and Sarah Mitchell." Thomas smiled at her. "And pleased to meet you, Sarah Mitchell," he said, "and though I wish it were under better circumstances." "Why are you helping me?" she asked, and the question seemed to cause her almost physical pain. "And you don't know me, and you don't know what I might have done." Thomas paused in his work and looked at her directly. "And I know you're hurt," he said. "And I know you're on my land. And I know that God didn't put me here to find you just so I could turn away, and that's enough for me." Sarah closed her eyes, and more tears came, and Thomas pretended not to notice and gave her privacy for her grief. The days that followed were hard ones, and Sarah burned with fever, and Thomas sat by her bedside and bathed her forehead with cool water and spooned broth between her lips when she could take it, and talked to her when she was restless, and sat quietly when she needed silence. On the third night her fever broke and she woke, clear-headed for the first time, and found Thomas asleep in the chair beside the bed, and his head tilted back at an angle that would make his neck sore, and his hand still holding the cloth he had been using to cool her fever. And she watched him. For a long time, this stranger who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. When Thomas woke, he found her watching him, and he sat up quickly. "And how are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I've been shot twice," she said, "and but better than I have. Any right to feel." Thomas smiled. "And that's a start," he said. Over the following weeks, as Sarah slowly healed, they fell into an easy rhythm, and Thomas did his daily work around the ranch, and Sarah rested and grew stronger, and they talked and shared stories, and Sarah learned that Thomas had come west as a young man full of dreams and had built this ranch with his wife, and they had been happy here, even though they never had the children they had hoped for, and when Margaret died he had stayed, because this land held all his memories of her, and leaving would have felt like abandoning her all over again. And slowly, carefully, Sarah told her own story, and she had been traveling with a man she thought she could trust, and he had promised her work at a ranch further north, and she had been desperate and alone after her father died and left debts she couldn't pay. And the man had seemed kind at first, but kindness had been a mask. And when she realized what he really intended, she had tried to run, and he had shot her and left her to die. Thomas listened, and his jaw tight with anger at what had been done to her, but his voice stayed gentle. "And I'm sorry you went through that," he said. "And I'm sorry. The world has so many hard edges, but you're here now and you're safe, and that's what matters." As autumn deepened into winter, Sarah grew strong enough to help around the house, and she cooked meals that were better than anything Thomas had eaten in years, and she mended his shirts and organized his chaotic collection of tools and supplies, and they worked side by side, and the silence between them was comfortable and easy. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Thomas working on a piece of leather tack and Sarah knitting socks from wool she had carded and spun herself, she spoke quietly. "I should probably move on soon," she said, "and I've imposed on your kindness long enough." Thomas looked up from his work, and his expression was carefully neutral. "And where would you go?" he asked. Shrugged. "And I don't know," she said. "And somewhere I can find work, I suppose, and somewhere I can start over." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and then he set down his tools and looked at her directly. "And you could stay here," he said. "And if you wanted to, and I could use the help, and the ranch is small, but it provides enough for two, and we work well together, and it would be proper and respectful, and you would be safe." Sarah stared at him. "And are you asking me to marry you?" she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. Thomas shook his head. "And asking you to stay," he said, "and asking you to be my partner in running this ranch, and if someday you wanted more than that, I would be honored. But if you just wanted a safe place to live and work and heal, I would be honored by that too, and I'm too old to play games, Sarah, and I'm offering you a home and no strings attached, and you can take it or leave it as you see fit." Sarah set down her knitting, and her hands were shaking, and she looked at this man who had saved her life and asked for nothing, and who was now offering her everything, and no one had ever been kind to her the way Thomas had been kind. "Yes," she said, "and I'd like to stay." The winter passed, and then spring came, and Sarah and Thomas worked the ranch together, and they expanded the vegetable garden and repaired the barn roof and welcomed new calves into the world. And somewhere during those months the boundaries between them shifted and softened. And one evening Sarah took Thomas's hand, and he held it gently, and that was enough for then. They married quietly that summer, and the circuit preacher performed the ceremony, and 2 neighboring ranchers served as witnesses, and it was simple and true, and exactly right. Thomas was 54 and Sarah was 28, and people in town talked as people in small towns do. But Thomas and Sarah didn't pay much attention, and they knew what they had built together, and they knew it was real, and that was all that mattered. Years passed, and the ranch prospered in its modest way, and Sarah proved to have a gift with horses, and Thomas loved to watch her work with them, and her patience and gentleness, transforming even the most skittish animals, and